Dr. Kayte, welcome to the Keto Camp podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
As a fellow Miamian in the house here at Keto Camp HQ,
That's right.
and you're doing some great work. You have a great story that I want you to share. And that story is very powerful because it's going to lead up to what this conversation is about. So before we get into all the things that you're doing and all things breast implants and detoxification, let's talk about your story. How did you get to where you are now?
Well, that is sort of a long question, but I would say I had a lifetime exposure to mercury from prenatal exposure from my mother who had a mouthful of amalgams, silver fillings. And then I received amalgams and silver crowns as a child. Some of them fell out as baby teeth. Some stayed with me into adulthood. I had two amalgams break in my mouth in my mid-20s, 1 year after another. And then I got breast implants, which also have mercury, along with other neurotoxic heavy metals and other toxins that are not heavy metals, but are destructive chemicals. Mm-hmm. And I started having health problems about 9 months after getting breast implants. So that was how it started.
So you had your bucket was full.
Yes, you're such a pampa. He gave me that phrase too. The mercury bucket. Yes.
Yeah, totally. A lot of my vocabulary is from Dr.
Yes,
Pampa, the amazing Dr. Pampa. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, first of all, before we get into the breast implants, what are the problems with silver amalgam fillings?
Well, the problem with silver amalgam fillings is that they have mercury in them. And mercury is a neurotoxin that causes all kinds of problems in the body. We get exposed to mercury from many places, and depending on your individual genetics and bioindividuality and health and age and all of those factors, you're going to process mercury different than somebody else. So if you're the type of person who has a hard time getting mercury out of your body, you're going to accumulate it and you're going to have more destructive negative effects. And sometimes when you're young, you can have a lot of mercury in your body and you do have symptoms, but you don't know that they're mercury symptoms. And because you're so healthy and young, it doesn't really affect you until you start to break down more as you age, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. You're right. So our genes play a role. Also, our stress bucket, like we talked about, play a role. And once that bucket gets full, we get symptoms. So for you, you had your bucket full from the amalgam fillings for your mom had. You had it yourself, the crowns. And then you had breast implants.
Correct. And the reason I mention prenatal exposures is because a lot of people will suffer one exposure and have like a catastrophic effect, like an instant onset of chronic fatigue syndrome, which I think is what Dr. Pampa talks about in his story. Mm-hmm. He had one bad dental procedure where the dentist removed the silver fillings in the non-safe way, and then he immediately felt really tired and awful and all like overnight, right? And then a lot of people ask, well, why does that happen? And there's a lot of things that we can't quantify, such as how much mercury was passed to you from your mother and the placenta through breast milk. And she could have inherited that mercury from her mother and it stayed in her body her whole life, right? And mercury, it's interesting. I've heard different theories about this, but we think that the mother might even pass more mercury to the fetus as almost a defense mechanism for her body. I don't have any like clinical evidence to back up that statement. It's just something I've heard clinically, and we don't know if it's true. But
yeah, it's an interesting hypothesis, though.
It's an interesting hypothesis.
So the problem with the mercury is that it gets stored in our hypothalamus pituitary.
It can,
which is the master controller of our body, and then everything downstream dysfunctions. That's
one thing that can happen.
Yeah.
That's one thing that can happen. Something that's interesting to talk about is when we ingest mercury we get from our diet, it's in the gut and then it can move into circulation and it likes to embed in sulfurated tissue. So it can be attracted to organ tissue like the brain, or it could end up in muscle tissue. And part of what we see a lot with people who do chelation or they use products that say they're for heavy metals, or they hear like medical medium talking about cilantro smoothies and spirulina and these weak chelators, or even glutathione, in an IV. I always talk about how you could have mercury in sort of, I don't want to say benign places, but places where they're not causing as much destruction, like what you just described. And then you can move around mercury without realizing it. And then once it gets mobilized, it could then go into the brain, like what you were describing, where it doesn't necessarily have to be if you have it in your body.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's good to know, because a lot of people, they're doing the cilantro smoothies, they're doing the glutathione injections, and there's a time and place for it, but you got to know what to do that day, to not allow it to redistribute or allow it to go into the body, and it might get stored in the brain.
Absolutely. And then there's a potential that you can get worse from even having chelation therapy from practitioners who don't fully understand the way the chelators work, their half-life, the way they redistribute, and then you could end up feeling worse after chelation. And I think that's why it's been one of those things over the years that we're, even as a practitioner, when I was a new doctor trying to learn about chelation, I was always a little scared and timid to get involved with it. And I just didn't know. It felt like there was a lot of unknowns, and it felt like something that could be dangerous if it was done wrong. And that's all true. So I'm happy to feel like I've demystified those things within myself, mainly because of going through it, right?
Yeah, and I love talking about this stuff because it's upstream, right?
Mm-hmm.
Diet is great. You want to make sure we're eating healthy foods and we're doing exercise and we're fasting. But if you don't get to the cause, the upstream cause, then it's hard to get well.
Absolutely. And I'm so happy you said that, because I see this all the time with functional medicine practitioners, that their go-to is to heal the gut, which I love that. Healing the gut is really important. And gut dysfunction is the number one thing for most people to get better, even when you look at autoimmunity and a lot of these other problems. However, if you're toxic with mercury, you're not going to be able to heal your gut until you address the mercury first. So
yeah, right on. I'm with you on that.
It's impossible. It's like you'll just be swimming upstream and trying to chase pathogens and have all kinds of blood sugar dysregularity.
So for you, you had, you said 9 months after your breast implants, you started to notice some things. What are some things that you noticed?
Well, I was 27 years old. I might have, no, it was my 28th birthday actually. So it was the same year I got implants. I had immediate alcohol intolerance, and it was a time in my life where it was normal for me to have a few drinks a night several times a week. And all of a sudden that I became extremely sick. And that was the first sign. And then I started having neurological changes, like confusion. My brain just wasn't working the way I knew it should. Also that feeling, that heavy kind of brain fog feeling. I had a ton of post-workout soreness. So I was a wrestler in high school and college, and I competed nationally. And I only talk about that because a lot of women in our culture, when they go to their medical doctor to try and get help for a pain or something, they're treated like they're very dismissed, and they're treated like their pain is maybe they're weak or sensitive, right? Whereas if you as a man went to your doctor and said, hey, I have a really bad headache, it's just sort of the stereotype that they're going to be like, whoa, this must be the worst headache he's ever had because he's a man, so that's why he came, and got help, right? Whereas a woman goes and they want to dismiss you, right? So I know what real pain feels like from training. I pushed to the max as a wrestler. I wrestled boys. I was the only girl on my high school team. So I learned the lesson of pushing through pain and not giving up because it's hard and all of that. So when I started to have this new pain after workouts, I knew right away that it wasn't normal. It wasn't just an intense workout pain.
Yeah.
So I stopped working out, and then I realized the pain was still there, and it just sort of sent me on this whole health journey, because at that time I wasn't working in the health space at all. And I became a chiropractor because I thought I had a musculoskeletal problem. I thought that, okay, my body's hurting. No one was telling me what was wrong. I saw several doctors. People had some theories, but nothing that was a slam dunk or made much sense. And most of them were like, there's nothing wrong with you because your labs are normal. I knew something was wrong. I knew I was in pain. So I went and became a chiropractor. And then the first term of chiropractic school, I realized that the chiropractic interventions and even acupuncture were not helping that pain. So I started studying functional medicine and learning about the metabolic causes of pain, and just continuing to search for why I was feeling bad. And then so.
I love it. I mean, it was a void that you wanted to fill with knowledge and seeking out why this was happening to you. And it led to what you're doing today. So it was a blessing because you got to this point in your life. So when did you realize that the breast implants were a problem?
Right. Okay. So one of the first, I started learning functional medicine through Jatiste Karazian that we were just discussing, and Vojani, who's sort of the father of food sensitivity testing. He's an immunologist, PhD. These are these incredible resources. And I was in Southern California, so I started working for Apex Energetics and just got exposed to these brilliant practitioners, and everyone was talking about autoimmune disease. So I was learning about all these cutting edge autoimmune things, about latex immune reactivity and even silicone immune reactivity. So I thought about those things. I learned about how, the FDA talks about anti-nuclear antibodies, which are a marker for connective tissue disease like lupus and just things like that are on the FDA fact sheet for silicone breast implants, because we've known since the 90s that when women get breast implants, it turns on autoimmunity. So that was something that I looked at and I thought about as a student, but I had no autoimmunity. So I was looking for those markers of inflammation, and they were not there.
So for those who are listening or watching who don't really understand what autoimmunity is and how do you turn off auto, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So autoimmunity, like any other disease, there's a genetic component, and what we see with autoimmunity is we often call it a lifestyle disease because there's unknown reasons why it will just all of a sudden turn on. So you might have the gene for it, and it never gets turned on or upregulated, and then there's a trigger event that could be like a death in the family or some emotional trauma, or it could be like putting silicone inside of your body. And then what happens is your immune system will start to attack a part of your body. So it could be the thyroid, and then that would be called Hashimoto's, or it could be the joints, and or the muscles, and there's a lot of different types of autoimmunity. Any part of your body that gets attacked is its own disease, right? So
yeah. So that was a great explanation. So for you figured out that all of a sudden you're getting through this research, silicones are a problem, you have them inside of you. What's the next thing that you did?
Well, what I figured out was that silicone is a problem for people who turn on autoimmune disease, and then that wasn't happening to me. So in my sort of, I would say, naive understanding of the body at that time, I thought it wasn't coming from my breast implants. So I sort of dismissed that as the cause. There were a lot of things about breast implants that I didn't know at that time. But, the journey continued, and I was still a student. I was going to conferences all over, and I was at an autoimmunity conference in Colorado taught by Dr. Brandon Lindell, who's like an amazing functional medicine practitioner in Colorado. And he threw a study up on the slides, and it said, silent ruptures in silicone are highly associated with fibromyalgia diagnoses. And I thought, wait, like fibromyalgia is basically pain, widespread pain that they don't know what's causing it, and then they give you that diagnosis. So that means that they've looked for everything else and it doesn't fit into any of those categories, so they don't really know what's causing it. So usually they'll just call it fibromyalgia. We're still searching for what it really is, right? Maybe it's Mercury.
Yeah.
But
it can be.
It could be, right?
Yeah.
It could definitely be. So that was an interesting light bulb moment for me, because I know if those women were diagnosed with fibromyalgia, that means that they didn't get diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, right? Because they would have, does that make sense? They would have been diagnosed with X, O, Y, Z.
Right.
So that was the first time I was like, wait a minute, because I kind of had like fibromyalgia. I mean, I wasn't diagnosed with it, but if I had tried to seek the allopathic diagnosis, that's what I would have, because I had widespread pain that from an unknown cause. So I thought, silent ruptures, wait a minute, like what? Because, that the plastic surgeons don't really like tell women that the FDA regulation is that you're supposed to get an MRI like every 2 to 3 years that you have silicone, because you don't really know what's happening to it. It could be ruptured. The shell could be degraded, although you can't see that on MRI anyway. But
so when it ruptures, it leaks.
It ruptures and you don't know it's ruptured, and it can be leaking. Although all of this is really moot because it doesn't have to be ruptured for it to cause all of these same problems. However, if you do have gel bleed or you do have a rupture, sometimes your symptoms are more severe, or they might come on faster, or it could be harder to get better because you have mobilized silicone, right? It's really sticky and it moves into lymph, and then it's harder to get out of your body, right? So after that, I started looking at breast implants again, and I started doing more research. And then I found out all the ingredients in breast implants, that there's mercury and lead and arsenic and platinum and aluminum. And like I said, a lot of other toxic heavy chemicals. So,
and molds, correct? Mold and mycotoxins can end there?
So we would be talking about that more in relationship to saline implants, because the older saline, there's many types of implants that have been made, but silicone were taken off the market I think from 92 to 2006 in the United States, because of lawsuits that happened. And they were still approved for women who had mastectomies, but then all the ones that were available were saline, which means they sort of have a shell that might be something like plastic, or it could be silicone, the shell.
Got it.
And then there's a valve, and then once it's inside of the body, it gets filled with saline, which is like salt water. And saline, the valve mechanism is not a perfect mechanism. So what we have seen in some people is that the pathogens can infiltrate into that, and then they sort of proliferate inside of the saline like a fish tank. Okay. And then you have this sort of ground zero pathogen activity. And because it's so close to the vagus nerve and the heart and the lungs and all the mast cells that hang out in the chest area, which release histamine when they're, when they want, when they're, when they get triggered. So,
the body's a complex system.
yeah. So it's, when you think, looking back, like, wow, these toxic chemicals are right next to your heart. I mean, when women are explanting and they're trying to go about it the proper way to prevent more leakage or spillage, we have conversations where the plastic surgeons are talking about scraping capsule tissue off of the rib and having to be very careful not to perforate a lung because we're talking about millimeters of distance, right? And then you start thinking, like, why would I ever cut my chest open and put something there that isn't a lifetime device that you're always going to have another surgery, right? So. And
it's right by the heart.
Right by the heart.
Yeah. So you found out all this information. You knew that. At what point did you say, oh, I'm going to get these out of me. I'm going to get I'm going to explant these.
Well, it's funny because I fell into the category of already not really liking my breast implants at this stage. I've talked to a lot of women so many women who felt the same way. By the time they learned implants were toxic, they didn't want them anyway. So they were just like, great, I can't wait to get rid of them. But then there's a lot of other women who don't take it well and they don't know what they would do without their implants. And it's really hard for them to kind of like emotionally cope with the physical changes and what that will mean for like the identity that they've formed around having the implants. And then there's also mastectomy patients who have no breast tissue and no nipples. And then they're facing their own challenges, right? Aesthetically.
So for you, you knew you wanted them anyways.
I didn't really even want breast implants. It sort of happened by accident. You go see a plastic surgeon and sometimes you end up getting talked into things that you didn't necessarily go there for, right? And in my case, I wanted a lift, I think. And he told me it didn't make any sense because women who haven't had children, if you get a lift, it becomes complicated, like moving the nipple, and it can sever the ducts, the milk ducts. And so like, just get implants. They'll solve your problems.
It added more problems. But you wouldn't be doing what you're doing now if you didn't go through it, right?
Absolutely. I don't look at it like it. I just think it's, in hindsight, it's hilarious.
It is kind of funny.
Yeah. So after I removed my implants, and I did the proper way using unblocked capsulectomy, and I'll give you links for where people can, or if they go to my Instagram and Linktree, I have links to the nonprofit breast implant illness group where the women have compiled like all the resources that you need. But unblock.
Your Instagram is Dr. Kayte.
Dr. Kayte.
Kayte.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll put in the YouTube video in the notes and just go follow her on Instagram.
Yeah.
Kayte, Dr. Kayte.
Yeah. Okay. So where were we?
You were getting them explanted the right way.
Yes. Yeah. So I removed them. And then I would say I was about half better, but you have to think about what's happening. Like if people listening have ever experienced like a detox reaction, in my case, I had a gel bleed, so my implants were sort of sweating their contents every day, and the liver and the kidneys and all of the detox organs don't really ever get a break, right? Because it's happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they're inside of your body. It's not like having a night out on the town and drinking and then sleeping, or like even being an alcoholic where you're drinking every day because you still sleep at night. You can't really physically drink or smoke 24 hours a day, but when you have something like toxic inside of you, it's the same thing, but it's sped up, right? It's like double time working.
So your organs were working overtime.
They're working overtime, keeping up with just and whatever they can't detox in the moment, they're going to store. That's like how our body works. It's smart. It's to help us, right? It's to prevent it from wearing itself out in the process. So then you remove them, and sometimes you can start detoxing really quickly because now your body's like, okay, I can let go of all this stored crap. And a lot of women find themselves going through almost an emotional roller coaster because of the way mercury and other chemicals impact estrogen primarily by depleting zinc, and when you have too many chemicals which act like estrogens, estrogens, right? They're mimicking estrogen and they're depleting zinc, and then you're retaining copper, which happens in estrogen dominance anyway, but then copper and zinc have this antagonistic or like the trade-off relationship where one goes low, the other goes high. And yeah, it makes them have this sort of crazy presentation, right? Plus, mercury is destroying lithium in the brain, and it
has an affinity for the thyroid.
Yes, we could talk about how it affects energy and the thyroid, and then it's like throwing a wrench in methylation And it's also depleting collagen by throwing a wrench in the mitochondrial function. So when it starts to get mobilized and redistributed, as can happen with Explant or as can happen with even a safe amalgam removal, right? It's important to sort of have these strategies in place to like know that you want to kind of like bind up all of that, right?
So would you recommend? Yeah, I understand what you're saying totally.
Right.
You don't want it to like just go rampant in the body because it could create the problems that you just described. So
Right.
do you recommend somebody do some downstream detox work open up their detox pathways before they get an explant?
Before Explant, I would say working on detox pathways is complicated because they're already they're burdened, but you're not able to remove the source. So it would be sort of like advising somebody to start detoxing while they're continuing to drink every day.
Or
like
they
alcohol.
have silver fillings in their mouth.
Right,
And they're pulling,
exactly.
and then just,
You don't want to pull. Yeah, like, so I don't use any of the chelators ever if someone still has implants or amalgams.
Correct.
That would be like a huge recipe for disaster. They're going to feel way worse, right? I like to just support the body, the healing process before and during and right after explant, because you have to remember you're going through like a huge trauma of being cut open and you're already probably sick. So you just want to make sure you're getting a lot of vitamin C, a lot of zinc, a lot of, vitamin E, magnesium, all of the things that get depleted by mercury.
Where could they find a list of all that?
Well, I'm deferring to Andy Keller's Core 4 when I'm talking about that. But these are just basic nutrients.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a diet that is typically it's helpful if it's high in healthy fats, proteins, they have vegetables. So things that are going to like really feed the body and help heal. And I don't really have a list of pre-surgery recommendations, but if you work with your practitioner, like, just tell them that you want to focus on healing, not detox, not during that time, if it makes sense.
Yeah, great advice. I mean, you just listed a whole bunch of things, so they could just. I hope you all are writing it down and taking notes here. This is a very important episode.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes this really feels like life or death, especially for some of these women who are bedridden. And part of the problem where they get to this point is because we don't have a lot of information about this in the mainstream, and a lot of doctors are not trained to understand.
And I live in Miami. You're from Miami. We're in Miami right now.
Right.
And it's very common to see breast implants in Miami, more so than other cities.
Yes.
I know you're in LA, so you see it there too. But
here you guys have silicone everywhere in the body. I mean, we're talking about a lot of other
So this type
areas.
of conversation is not happening enough. And if it's heard, usually someone will think, yeah, that's a whole bunch of like nonsense, or, I feel fine. So what would you say to something about something like that?
If someone said that they feel fine and they have breast implants in their body,
Mm-hmm.
well, I would say that's good that, you're not in the state, but I would want them to be educated on what's in the implants, because I think that's part of the informed consent that gets missed.
Yes.
Now, if you come if I'm a plastic surgeon and you come in and you want breast implants and I tell you, and this is what's going on right now with the FDA labeling. So we're petitioning right now because they're undergoing changes to the way they label them and the way they talk about informed consent. And we're trying to, actually, I think December 23rd is the deadline to report and tell the FDA what you want on the labels so that they don't hide the ingredients, which is something that I think some pharma companies want. But yeah, if you go in and I'm like, hey, these are the implants, they have mercury, lead, arsenic, platinum, aluminum, platinum, all these chemicals, just so you know, it's kind of like we don't want to drink out of something that has BPA. Mm-hmm. We don't want to drink out of a plastic cup. But so maybe you don't want that stuff in your body if you know. A lot of people think that it's just silicone and it's made from sand and it's this natural, no big deal device. So I would say get educated on what those are, what the ingredients are, and also think about what's going to happen when it's time to replace, because maybe you want to leave them alone for now, but eventually the time's going to come where you're going to have to replace them, and the plastic surgeon is going to try to sell you the newest, most cohesive implant, and the most cohesive implant has the most chemicals in it. The reason why is because the lawsuits in the 90s were all about the implants breaking in the body and mobilizing and moving and not being cohesive, and that was causing a lot of problems. So then they took them off the market, reformulated them, and they're like, now look, you can run them over with a car, you can step on them, cool. Well, why? Because they have more chemicals now.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing a lot more people getting sick from what I call the mitochondrial model, which is not the autoimmune model. It's more of some of the other stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah. So I'd love for you to talk about the emotional impact that it has. And you talked about it a little bit, but what are some tips you can share for somebody who had just had their breast implants removed and it's been very traumatic for them? You've been through it. What are some emotional things you could share for them?
So I think sometimes and I went through this myself, and I ended up beginning a supplementation of plant lithium orotate. Actually, I use one that's even less strong than the orotate. I use like just the regular plant lithium from Biotics, but I've used orotate sometimes. You're feeling really bad. There's a high chance it's because of how the chemicals have affected your brain over many years. I don't know if that's everyone, then this is not medical advice, but you can work with your practitioner before you start supplementing to do a hair test, and you can measure your mineral status and see if it has to be interpreted in a specialized way, because it's not just like, oh, it's high or low in the hair, so it means it's high or low in the body. Like, no, you have to use just critical thinking and think like, well, if it's high, maybe I'm excreting all of it and not utilizing it and such. So you have to compare it to symptoms. But there are strategies. There's ways that you can improve estrogen dominance and balance your hormones. You can supplement with things that are going to help you make serotonin so that you don't feel so bad if you're feeling really, really, really low, and you know that it's more than it used to be, and it's not normal for you, and it's not situational, and it just seems like it keeps going. There's definitely strategies. So
you just listed a whole bunch.
Yeah.
I love it.
Those are some. And then I would say definitely at the appropriate time, start thinking about chelation if it makes sense for you, if you have the Mercury kind of model. And I talk about Mercury so much. There's all these other heavy metals and they have their own side effects, but we sort of think of Mercury as the ringleader. And when there's a high amount of Mercury in the body, it seems like the body holds on to other heavy metals. And then once you kind of lower the Mercury bucket, you can start getting rid of others like aluminum and lead. And
Mercury's the ringleader, the bully of the block.
It just for some reason seems like it makes it harder to detox. Even like gadolinium, which is IV contrast, and gadolinium is supposed to clear the body really fast. It's supposed to leave in 2 months, and I still have gadolinium in my body from over 2 years ago, and I think it's because Mercury. So we're addressing that now.
Awesome. Let's talk a little bit about how does somebody test if they have high amounts of mercury, heavy metals? Because I know if you were wondering, I want to know if I have this mercury in my body. How do they test?
Well, yeah. And so you can test for it. There's many different ways, and there's a lot to say about each way of pros and cons. And it's sort of like a puzzle. So let's say you were next to an explosion yesterday and you got exposed to a lot of mercury, and then we did a blood test the next day or even within a few weeks. We could look at your blood and we could say, oh, wow, you have high levels of mercury in your blood. Like, this is dangerous. Let's chelate immediately. And then that would be a situation where maybe we would use an IV, because we want to put that chelator in and get it like the DMSA or the DMPS, and we would want to get all that acute mercury immediately out of your body before it can embed in tissue, right? But the thing about mercury is it has this ability to sort of and to go into all the complicated chemistry of how it happens, I can't do, but the research is out there if you want to find it. Basically, it finds its way into the cell and then it changes the cell so that it doesn't leave. So it kind of like locks itself in. And that makes it very challenging to leave the body, even for your own detox abilities and your own pathways. So that's why chelators start to become important. Now, not everybody stores mercury in the same way. So sometimes you can have an exposure and you can clear it, and there's genetic reasons, and there's just so many factors to why that happens. But if you're storing it, and you do a blood test and you have a lot of mercury in your body that's stored, you probably will not have high levels on that blood test, right? Because it's in the tissue, it's not in the blood. It's the same thing if you were to do a urine test. You might catch some situational mercury or other chemicals that have been passing through that you were just exposed to, but you're not going to have a true reading of what's going on in the brain, in the tissue, in the nerves, in the organs, whatever. Sometimes doctors will prescribe a high dose of a chelator, like a very high dose of something like DMSA, and you take it orally right before you do the urine test. And it's cool because then you have the 6-hour window where you're collecting urine, and you say, okay, I caught this much mercury from the chelator, so it pulls it out of the tissue, right? And you catch it in the urine. But like, is that a true measure of what's in the body? We don't necessarily know. And then you also have to remember that heavy metals have weight among each other. So some are heavier than others. Mercury and lead are much heavier than like thallium and gadolinium, right? So if I, like in my case, I had high gadolinium in my body. So when I did the DMSA challenge, it's grabbing whatever it can first, right? So it's grabbing the gadolinium first and the thallium and whatever else. And then on my urine test, I had kind of like moderate mercury and then really high of these other lighter metals. So if I were to do the same test 6 months later after chelating, I could see now mercury is really high now that, you know, the DMSA has grabbed all the light metals, and then I can start pulling the heavier ones. This was just like so hard to know. It's not really accurate. And then there's also concern that if you're very toxic, it can stir it up and redistribute it and make you feel way sicker. So we don't really do those tests for everyone. It's kind of like, it's situational, but.
Same thing with me.
Okay. So,
and I explained that because it's important to work with the practitioner first and foremost who knows this stuff, because if you're doing it yourself, it's going to drive yourself crazy.
Yeah.
I did my heavy metals test and I had all those other metals that were high. I had lead that was high. I had bismuth that was high for some reason. Mercury was not high, but I had 8 silver fillings for 20 years. So that's a perfect example right there.
Right. Absolutely. And it's the same thing with the hair test. So when you look at the hair test, you're not looking for heavy metals in the hair. You're looking for mineral derangement. So you see like, oh, mercury has this destructive effect on zinc, and it has this destructive effect on lithium or magnesium. And so you can read in the hair how your body is utilizing minerals. And then you can say, okay, clinical history, exposure, symptoms, and now mineral derangement. Okay, it's pretty suspicious of mercury. I would like you to replenish all these minerals, and, you know, that's like where you start. And then you start thinking about chelation, and it really depends on your personal health, like what other stuff is going on. Sometimes chelation is not appropriate. Sometimes it's really not.
Right.
There is something that's kind of fun called the acid test, which is alpha lipoic acid. You take your body weight into like fourths, I think. So for someone like you, or it's probably maybe like a 20, for me, it'd be like probably a 25 milligram ALA, for you like a 50. And then you take ALA within its half-life every 2 to 3 hours for 3 days. And we're talking about alpha lipoic acid. I don't know if I said that.
You did.
And we're looking for a reaction. So it's very common for people to feel better, and like better than they usually do, or euphoric, or feel just like great, or maybe really sick. Both of those are positives on the acid
So you want a
test.
reaction.
Yes, and that means you're chelating something.
So does it give you any data whether if they're getting a positive reaction, does that mean something versus a negative reaction? What is the difference there?
No, it just has no.
Okay.
So I
That's
wish,
what me
I
neither.
wish
I
we
didn't
could.
have it.
Yeah, it's because alpha lipoic acid is probably one of the most complicated and amazing things that exist. It's this profound antioxidant, and it has all these abilities to affect the cell. So
it crosses the blood-brain barrier.
And it's the only chelator that crosses the blood-brain barrier.
So for me, when I take it, I feel worse, but it's a reaction, so it's good.
But what dose? Right. So we could talk about
the dose that
the
you
factors,
said. Yeah.
Like 50 milligrams.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I spread it out morning and nighttime.
So I would
4
gander,
on, 10 off.
Right. I would gander that you might be one of those people who needs to take ALA closer within its half-life. Yeah. So the idea with half-life is like, let's say you have your chelator that has its 2 thiol groups, and it goes through the body and it grabs onto mercury using its correct structure. And that's why, like with glutathione, it has 1 thiol group. So it kind of is a weak chelator. Same with some of those other weak chelators. They don't have the double group to hold it.
Did you hear that? Glutathione is a weak chelator because it only has one of these
it's also
claws.
Wonderful. It does many
it's
wonderful
great,
things. But in this situation,
here,
it can be a weak chelator that can move metals. So you want to really grab it. So the ALA is like a great chelator. Well, ALA is not also like the best chelator ever. There's pros and cons to its chelating, but for this discussion, it has 2 thiol groups. It grabs on, it goes in the brain, it pulls it out, and then it starts transporting it out of the body through the bloodstream. And then maybe 2 hours goes by, and its half-life expires, and it just drops the mercury wherever it is.
Yeah.
And then now the mercury, maybe it grabbed mercury from a muscle, and it's floating around in the blood, and then now it goes in the brain. So now you have this like neurological decline that's insidious. And this is why I don't like people to take alpha lipoic acid once a day, which happens all the time in blood sugar support regimens and for diabetes. And they're taking like a high amount, like 200 milligrams to 600 milligrams, right? And we're talking about taking 25 milligrams. Yeah. And some people are taking 6 when they're really sick, right? So for you, I would say try doing a lower dose, like 12 I mean, this is not medical advice.
Totally. Yeah. I get it.
But,
disclaimer.
But but a hypothetical situation would be taking 12 milligrams every 2 to 3 hours. We have to wake up in the middle of the night and do it too.
Yeah.
You can't sleep through your dose because you're going to redistribute.
Yep. Great advice. I'm gonna experiment with it.
Okay.
Okay, I have some final questions for you here.
Okay.
I have my rapid fire, which I didn't let her see because
Oh,
I said,
gosh.
"Oh, here are your questions." Then I said, "Oh, wait a minute. I don't want you to see the rapid fire."
Okay.
So, rapid fire. I want you to answer whatever comes to your mind first,
Okay.
and we'll go right down the list.
Okay.
7 questions.
This is like a Freudian psychological.
It's fun.
plot.
It's
Okay.
fun. I always like looking at rapid fire questions or hearing it on podcasts. Okay. What is your favorite detox supplement and why?
It's alpha-lipoic acid, and we already talked about why.
Perfect. Out of all the health tools out there, fasting, keto, all the things you talked about, what's your favorite and why?
Fasting.
Fasting. Why?
Because fasting is anti-aging and it resets everything, and it's sort of a great starting point. And it's a tool that's free, that's innate, that's part of many religions, and it's sort of been with us since the invention of man. And I think we're all overexposed to food and resources, and at least in the first world here. And so we're not really meant to be eating as much as we're eating, right?
Totally. Fasting is also my favorite. Before I move on to the next question, what's your fasting schedule?
I like to do water fasting once a week for 24 hours, and that's about all I can handle with my schedule. And then sometimes once a year, I'll be able to do a longer fast for 3 to 5 days.
And do you do like daily intermittent fasting, like 14, 16 hours?
I try to, but it doesn't always happen. In a perfect world, I would support that. For me, I'm sort of still building and in the catabolic phases. Right.
So you want to be more an anabolic
Anabolic.
mTOR.
Oh,
You want
my
to be more
TOR.
mTOR.
Thank you. I'm
Okay.
like blinking.
Got it.
Yes,
Got it.
thank you.
So your goal right now is more
I'm trying
mTOR,
to
less
grow.
autophagy.
Yes.
Got it.
Less autophagy, more. Although, yeah, we could talk. That's, yeah.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I love it. It's a great answer because not everybody has the same goals, and that's your goal. So it could change in a year from now when you put on what you want to do and you achieve those goals. What's the first thing you think of in the morning after you wake up?
Well, if I'm being totally honest, I think I try to remember where I hid my cell phone because I always hide it for myself at night in the other room. I found that I used to sleep with it on airplane mode next to me, and then I started putting it in the other room, and it was profound how much better my sleep was. So the airplane mode was not cutting it. So typically I'm like, where did I leave it? Is it in the bathroom? Is it in the living room?
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, it's a good answer. I do the same thing. I put it on airplane mode and I put it in the same spot, so I'm not thinking about
okay.
it.
That's smart.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever heard?
I think the best piece of advice, I would say it's sort of the best. It was what it was that hit me so hard. It was liars don't heal. If you're lying about anything in your life, anything at all, whether, I mean, you could kind of like deconstruct that on your own. It's important to sort of be authentic always, and that's can be a huge obstacle for recovery. I think if you're not sort of in alignment with everything you say has to sort of match up with what you do. Like you have to walk the walk.
Live it to lead it.
You have to live it to lead it. Yeah, but that's not my thing. But yes,
But that's true.
I think
That I've never heard that before. Liars don't heal.
Well, it's Caroline Myss, as I'm paraphrasing,
brilliant.
but that's where I heard it from. And
I
she's
love it.
like a amazing teacher. She's a medical intuitive, but she's a PhD and she's a publisher, and she's written like 10 books or more.
What's a great line. It's so true.
Amazing.
I agree with that. What's the worst piece of advice you've ever had?
To take alpha-lipoic acid once a day. No. I think
That's
the worst.
a pet peeve of yours.
A doctor told me once that I needed to eat like 180 grams of protein a day, and that's why I was sick. And
This is not even when you were wrestling.
no, this was like 2 years ago. I
Oh my
think.
gosh.
Yeah. And so I tried. I really tried because I respected him, and I wanted to see, and that was not the problem,
Mhm.
And then overloading that much protein can cause its own
yeah,
issue.
that's a lot. What was your favorite TV show growing up?
Wow. Well, so we lived on a boat for a good part of my childhood and on an island, and we didn't have a TV. So I missed a lot of shows. And then like a teen, I
Yeah.
really liked Alias, which is a show about like a female spy, and she was really good at karate and fighting. And I
Cool.
think I related as a young wrestler.
Yeah, that's cool. I can see that. Last rapid fire question is, if you had one superpower, what would that superpower be?
I would have to say a time travel probably, because I'm so frustrated with traffic now. And I just want to be everywhere. And I feel like with technology, we're getting exposed to all this cool stuff everywhere. And it's just like you can just know about it, but you can't do it because of logistics.
Yeah, so just bypass traffic.
Yes.
But don't get your car towed, right?
Yes. Yeah, that happened. Yeah.
That happened. We'll get into that.
This is Miami.
Okay, so that was an amazing interview. Well, actually, I have two questions before I acknowledge you. What is your definition of perfect health?
So perfect health means that you are in present time and you have all the available energy of your body, of your chi, to allocate to whatever is needed in the moment. So you could get cut, or you could break a bone, and you would heal. Like, you would heal easily. We're not immune to having health problems come at us. Like, even the healthiest people encounter trauma, right? But I think part of the problem is that we just like don't have our full forces on deck to be able to be present and heal our bodies. And that's really what perfect health is.
Yeah, I love it. The ability to adapt is what you're saying.
It's the ability to not have like all these parts of your energetic field and your mind like in other places, to just be like with yourself and be able to fully commit to whatever is at hand.
I love it.
Yeah.
What are you grateful for today?
Well, I'm really grateful I got to spend time with my mom, with my best friend, here with you. Like, the rain stopped, so we're having a wonderful day, and I'm excited. It's about to be Christmas.
Yeah. So much to be grateful for.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
The rain did stop. Drew Manning has been here for his birthday, and I'm like, I'm sorry, buddy. It's been raining all week for you.
Yeah. It was hurricane raining the
It
last
was,
few days. Like,
yeah.
not just the normal Florida drizzle. So I think that we're really in the ocean, and we're pretending like this is a city, but it's not. It's really just the ocean.
It's a problem.
That's going to...
Dr. Kayte,
Yes.
today was awesome. This is the first time we had somebody on this show to talk about breast implants and what it does. So I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, all of your experiences. I can't even imagine what you had to go through to that whole emotional journey. And I'm grateful that you went through it, because now you're educating so many people. You're doing great work. I really love your content. And thank you so much for coming out to Keto Camp HQ. It was an amazing conversation, and I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me, and I appreciate all the work you're doing. And I'm happy that your audience will know more about breast implants now,
They will.
hopefully.
Awesome.
All right.
Good job.